Judges, this is team number 681. The next thing I'm going to do for one final time is to read the rules to you. You will have 15 minutes to present your plan. Those 15 minutes will include any time you wish to allocate to introductions. The judges will not ask questions during this first 15 minutes. I will alert you when I start the timer. I will alert you when you have 5 minutes to go, 1 minute to go, and then when your time is up. I will be curt when time is up and stop you mid-sentence if need be. We will then transition to the Q&A portion. You will have another 15 minutes to field and address questions from our distinguished panel of judges. If your team is answering a question when the time is called, I will let the person answering the question complete their thought. However, they may not switch to other thoughts, nor may other students contribute to the answer. At no time during your presentation or during Q&A should you reveal your individual names or your school affiliation. You may only reveal your team number. Faculty advisors may be in the audience for both the presentation and the Q&A, but may not participate. Once your team has finished, you may join the audience to watch the other teams, which obviously you're the last group today, so you're going to get to go straight to lunch. So with that, when you're ready, if you will tell me, I will start the timer.
We're all set.
Okay, go right ahead. Timer started.
Welcome to Team 681's presentation for the 2023 Fiscal Challenge. Let's start by discussing the state of the national economy and the national debt.
Federal spending contains discretionary spending, legally required mandatory spending, and interest payments on the national debt. Currently, the U.S. spends approximately $1.7 trillion in discretionary spending, $4.1 trillion in mandatory spending, and $475 billion in interest payments. The latter is a 35% increase over 2021. The U.S. is approaching its debt ceiling of $31.4 trillion. However, the general consensus is that Congress will provide a temporary solution. We factored this expectation and the overall uncertainty into our projections.
The Federal Reserve is raising interest rates to try to slow inflation, which remains at its highest level in 3 decades. Rising prices and interest rates have created recessionary concerns.
The current U.S. debt-to-GDP ratio is 97%, and the CBO projects this will reach 185% in 30 years. Higher debt levels means a larger portion of taxpayer dollars are going towards interest payments rather than public demands. This situation can and should be addressed now to maintain American economic stability.
Our proposal grows both revenue and GDP while decreasing spending, leading to a debt-to-GDP ratio of 97.1 by 2053. This will help the U.S. return to a green economy from both a financial and environmental perspective. Our policies fall under 5 components of green, which are generate revenue, reform spending, explore new regulations, elevate productivity, and nurture the environment.
We evaluate how each policy affects Americans by exploring 4 common household profiles. Glenn is a senior citizen, Sarah is a single mom, Todd is a wealthy corporate executive, and Michael is a young high school graduate.
We'll start by looking at policies that generate revenue. Currently, only the wealthiest 0.2% of Americans pay the 40% estate tax due to a high exemption limit. Lowering this exemption to $1 million will increase annual revenue from this tax by 60.5%. The average American receives $46,000 in inheritance and thus will not be affected.
Over 30 years, the $2.8 trillion increase in revenue causes the debt-to-GDP ratio to decrease by 8.5 percentage points. You can see this policy's impact on our debt-to-GDP ratio tracker on the right. The dark green represents the 8.5 percentage point decrease, while the lighter green represents the remaining projected ratio after accounting for this policy.
The SALT deduction disproportionately benefits wealthy taxpayers who live in regions with higher taxes. Abolishing the SALT deduction will increase government revenue by $6.3 trillion and lower the debt-to-GDP ratio by 11.3 percentage points over the next 30 years.
Increasing taxes will decrease total GDP by $1 trillion during this time. We lowered our debt-to-GDP estimates to account for decreases in state and local spending.
We propose reducing the current Social Security payroll tax by 0.5 percentage point for both groups to 5.7%. This reduces annual tax revenue by about $75 billion, but increases wages by a similar amount. Phasing out the home interest mortgage deduction over 5 years would offset lost revenue by 2034. Currently, people can deduct up to $750,000 of interest paid on their mortgages which is proven to mainly incentivize buying larger homes and increasing overall housing costs.
This should be politically feasible, as the policy is supported by think tanks like Brookings, and Congress recently lowered the mortgage tax exemption by $250,000. Over 30 years, the $1.4 trillion increase in GDP and $1.14 trillion increase in revenue will result in the debt-to-GDP ratio decreasing by 5.5 percentage points.
Let's see how these policies affect Americans. Todd, the corporate executive, will pay more taxes due to the lowered estate tax exemption and the lack of SALT deduction. Sarah, the single working mom, will have increased disposable income due to lowered payroll taxes.
Next, let's look at proposals that reform spending. Currently, the Social Security Administration projects that it will run out of funds by 2037. Additionally, the U.S. Census Bureau reports that senior poverty rose to 10.2% in 2021. A major component of senior poverty is regressive Social Security payouts. Those with the least ability to save receive the least benefits.
To reduce senior poverty and keep Social Security solvent, we propose phasing in benefits to a flat 150% payout of the federal poverty level. While this improves benefits for the lowest earners, it hurts high earners, who we would compensate by raising the IRA contribution limit. Over 30 years, these changes result in a $1.07 trillion decrease in spending and will lower the debt-to-GDP ratio by 4.2 percentage points.
The DoD's operation and maintenance appropriation accounts, which are for operating costs, will have spending that exceeds the rate of inflation. We propose limiting the growth of this budget to the rate of inflation with the following two policies. Currently, service members get an annual raise that is equal to the percentage change in the employment cost index for workers in the private industry. We propose capping basic military pay raises at 0.5 percentage points below the ECI, which accounts for 10% of the decrease in expected future budget over 30 years.
Additionally, there are currently 300,000 active duty soldiers in support roles whose positions could easily be filled by fewer civilians. We proposed allowing civilians to fill these roles and repositioning the soldiers. This will account for 10% of the decrease in the expected future budget over 30 years. The DoD will decide how to allocate the remaining 80%. Our proposal addresses some of the issues stated in the poor audit opinion of the DoD's financial records. Over 30 years, the $2.49 trillion decrease in debt from this policy will result in the debt-to-GDP ratio decreasing by 7.1 percentage points.
According to the Lancet Journal of Public Health, over 25% of health-related expenses in the U.S. are due to preventable factors. However, the CDC reports that only 8% of middle-aged Americans receive recommended preventative care, largely due to financing concerns. Currently, Medicare and private insurer coverage for preventative care is limited and complicated.
We propose a $100 incentive for a yearly checkup and expanding existing Medicare coverage to include preventative treatments while lowering restrictions. Research from the Harvard Business Review suggests that even a modest increase in preventative care rates results in significant savings. Costs increase in the short term but dramatically reduce later, with the projected spending decrease of $4.29 trillion over 30 years and 11.2 percentage point reduction in the debt-to-GDP ratio.
Michael, the young high school graduate, is worried that cuts in military spending will negatively affect America's global influence. On the other hand, Sarah, the single working mom, appreciates that Social Security will remain solvent and that the new preventative care benefits will help her family.
The first E in our green proposal represents the E in exploring new regulations. The COVID pandemic dramatically advanced the rollout of telehealth. We have the opportunity now to develop the regulatory structures that will expand access to care. We propose a 5-year, 25% tax credit on up to $1 million of telehealth investment, as well as standardized federal regulations for telemedicine. This will encourage companies to reinvest savings and incentivize research.
This policy is projected to increase healthcare savings by 10% over projected levels, decrease Medicare spending, and boost GDP through company investments. Over 30 years, these changes increase GDP by $1.9 trillion and decrease spending by $200 billion for a total drop of 5.2 percentage points in debt to GDP.
Current single-family zoning requirements have driven up home prices and created housing shortages in America's most densely populated areas. Studies by Stanford economists have found that the free movement of people to where they would maximize earnings would increase U.S. GDP by 7 to 9%.
We propose eliminating single-family zoning within a 5-mile radius of census-designated cities. This will empower developers to put the most desirable and efficient housing in our most economically important areas. It's important to note that lower housing costs will reduce the value of existing structures and may face pushback from those who wish to preserve neighborhood character. But the benefits of increased housing in productive areas outweigh these concerns. Over 30 years, this will lead to a $705 billion decrease in spending. $3.3 trillion increase in GDP, and 10.5 percentage point reduction in the debt-to-GDP ratio.
Glenn struggles to use the new telehealth system and resents the zoning regulations that are changing his neighborhood. On the other hand, Michael can now afford a home closer to his job and gets his yearly checkup online.
The second E in our green proposal represents elevating productivity. 20% of U.S. workers are employed in licensed industries, but differing state requirements make it difficult to provide services where they are most needed. Through its power to regulate interstate commerce, Congress can reduce additional licensing requirements and interstate restrictions, which has been recommended by both the Brookings and Cato Institute.
If someone's certified to cut hair in one state, there's no reason they shouldn't be able to do so in another state. And this will provide Americans with increased opportunities. Over 30 years, the resulting $540 billion increase in GDP will cause the debt-to-GDP ratio to drop by 2.3 percentage points.
America faces declining population growth rates and labor shortages. According to the IMF, increasing immigration by an average of 1 percentage point per year can boost GDP by 1% every 5 years. We propose a visa program modeled after the H-1B system, except this targets entry-level service jobs where labor supply is low. These immigrants would be ineligible for welfare for their first 3 years because, according to the BLS, they would make enough to support themselves.
Immigration would adjust to the available supply of jobs. More immigrants get matched when there are more jobs. Over 30 years, the 0.2 annual increase in GDP growth rate, combined with Part 2 of this policy, will cause the debt-to-GDP ratio to decrease by 10 percentage points. To increase political feasibility, we propose investing an additional $50 million a year in improved border security infrastructure,
5 minutes remaining.
so we can create a more efficient system that supports our immigration proposal.
Michael appreciates the expanded career opportunities from licensing deregulation, but he may face competition from immigrants for certain jobs. Todd's business, on the other hand, will thrive from the greater access to cost-effective labor.
Finally, we discuss our policies that nurture the environment. In the U.S., deer are overpopulated by almost 10 million. According to studies by Cornell and Rutgers, deer overpopulation causes habitat loss, the spread of diseases, and a 10 to 25% loss in farm production each year. We propose increasing the quantity of deer hunted by 30% over the next 10 years and then reducing it back to the current level. GDP will be boosted due to an uptick in demand for hunting supplies and an increase in agricultural yields. State and federal tax revenue would also increase.
States maintain legal control over their wildlife, so to encourage states to increase hunting, the federal government will designate those with overpopulation problems. For the next 10 years, these states would be eligible for 50% back on federal taxes for deer hunted above the current level up to that 30% increase. Over 30 years, the $34.1 billion increase in revenue and $525 billion increase in GDP will cause the debt-to-GDP ratio to drop by 2.6 percentage points.
We encourage domestic manufacturing with fewer carbon emissions by instituting a carbon tax, something most other developed countries already have. Our policy rewards companies for cutting their emissions. There will be a base rate of $25 per metric ton of emissions, adjusted for inflation. Each company will have a benchmark emissions to productions ratio set by the previous year's quantities. A 1% decrease in this ratio corresponds to a 1% reduction in that company's carbon tax rate, incentivizing efficiency.
Over 30 years, the $2.8 trillion increase in tax revenue will result in the debt-to-GDP ratio decreasing by 9.5 percentage points. According to a study by the Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy, there would also be up to a 10% reduction in carbon emissions.
As a business owner, Todd would not appreciate the additional costs imposed by the carbon tax. On the other hand, these policies preserve the environment for Michael's future lifetime.
It's impossible to know the exact impact of our policies, so we projected a range of outcomes by looking at policies in other countries, possible political scenarios, and confidence intervals from the studies we cited. Our low debt to GDP estimate is an aggregate of the best case scenario for each policy, and our high estimate is the aggregate of the worst case scenarios. All outcomes in this range put the U.S. on a sustainable fiscal path.
We understand that the political process is nuanced and complex. Thus, we included policies that would appeal to both sides of the aisle and the American public. For example, abolishing the salt tax deduction, strengthening border security, and encouraging hunting are more right-leaning policies. Urban development, increased immigration, and carbon tax are more left-leaning policies. Ideas that would receive bipartisan support include investing in telehealth and preventative health care. High earners would likely be least supportive of our proposal, While a vast majority of Americans would benefit from the continued solvency of federal programs like Social Security, economic growth, due to infrastructure and healthcare investment, and a cleaner future environment.
Our policies, growing revenue, reforming spending, exploring new regulations, elevating productivity, and nurturing the environment help the U.S. avoid fiscal disaster while improving quality of life. Together, they decrease the projected debt-to-GDP ratio by 87.9 percentage points over 30 years. This brings down the total estimated ratio from 185% to 97.1%. This proposal gives our government the funding and flexibility it needs to maintain a prosperous, green future for the lives and balance sheets of Americans. Thank you.
1 minute remaining. Okay, we'll now go to our Q&A session. Which judge would like to start first?
I'll do it. Can you go back to the slide with the deer hunting? I think everyone kind of...
Support this question.
Well, when I was trying to, and I apologize, but if I don't say it, I won't sleep tonight. What's the bang for buck on this one? I wouldn't be able to sleep if I didn't say it. It's bothering me. But this probably is a very small dollar thing. So was this geared for trying to balance the left-right politics? Is that why you put it in?
That is part of the reason why it was included. Additionally, there have been various studies done by universities like Cornell, like Rutgers, additionally University of Wisconsin-Madison, that are showing that a lot of farms in the United States are losing between 20 and 25% of crop yields due to deer overpopulations. At the same time, they're bringing in a host of other issues. Things like Lyme disease are being spread more due to ticks from deer, a lot of things like that. And we want to look at that issue and focus on the environment, as our theme is green, so we want to focus on nurturing the environment. And through other research, we found that hunting does generate quite a bit of money, and there is significant amounts of revenue from tax dollars. And by doing this, this is something that doesn't cost the government much at all. It doesn't cost the government anything. So.
Big bang for buck.
And touching on the political feasibility aspect you mentioned, traditionally it can be a little trickier to find right-leaning environmental policies, so we thought this one was quite creative and also really does work and has a tangible impact.
I have some questions about your Social Security changes, and partly this is just because you guys have a lot of policies that you talked about, and so it went rather quickly, and so I just wanted to provide a little bit more time if you could talk a little bit more in depth about what your Social Security policies are. Which is not really a question, I guess.
Questions? Can you explain in more detail?
You already passed it. So, yeah, our Social Security policy is essentially just setting the Social Security payouts to 150% of the federal poverty line. And so essentially, the way one possible way to implement this would be to over 10 years reduce the maximum payment in the Social Security system and increase the minimum payment until both reach 150 in 10 years.
Also, the current average of 160% is skewed toward high earners. So if you make more, you put more into the system, you get more out of it. But we know that the people that really live off of Social Security are those lower and middle income families. And so by flattening it to 150%, you're hurting high earners a little bit, but you are really benefit those lower earnings that might even get like a little boost in their payouts. And then we also balance it with the IRA contribution limit for higher earners.
So looking at your proposal just as a whole, imagine that it were implemented. What's the biggest risk to this proposal?
So one of the advantages of our proposal is that we don't have a lot of upfront costs. So we tried to set up on purpose so that wouldn't be a risk. But what that does mean is that a lot of our proposals are trusting that we can implement something and hope that we benefit from that. A great example is turning back to the hunting policy. We're trusting that states will take those tax benefits and try to increase hunting to help increase our agricultural yields. We're trusting that other policies will get set in motion and that as they kind of work in the long term, that it will benefit. Looking at carbon tax emissions, that will generate revenue no matter what, but we're hoping with the structure of it, companies will also cut back on their emissions, be encouraged to do so. We're hoping that the benefits we include in here will be enough to do that.
And one of the other biggest things is we expect that Congress is going to be able to seek this political balance because we have some policies that are more right-leaning, some that are more left-leaning. And so we hope that they won't look at each of these policies unilaterally, but as a whole package.
And we also have those confidence intervals that we use to kind of factor in some of that risk. And the reason we did it policy by policy was because we know some policies, for example, when you have a policy where you do the spending up front, like the preventative care, then that's more of a risk because you don't really know what your return is. As with the policies that have the tax deductions, it's like you only spend as much money as well as it works. And so those confidence intervals found individually can be aggregated to account for a lot of that.
Can I ask you a question on the estate tax? So I know the number. You set the limit at $1 million because it was I'm not sure what year it was that tax change, but the reason it was changed is because the $1 million was catching a lot of family farms, small businesses. Some people have houses that are now $1 million, so you can have house exclusion. The argument has been, no, if it's $12 million, you're only getting 0.2% of the estates that are being valued. You're going to an 11%. Did you try to find a different number between 1 million and 12 million, so you'd try to get rid of that family farms, or what? Like trying to, like President Biden, he was trying to make sure you didn't tax in the top 2%. So did you try to look at other numbers, or did you just go back to $1 million because that's what it was several years ago?
So we picked 1 million for a couple of reasons. The gift tax scales up from 18% to 40%, and the 40% mark is at that 1 million. The other thing is the Committee for Budget and Policy Proposals, or Budget and Policy Priorities, says that only 1.3% of the items that are affected by the estate tax are like the small businesses and family farms. And so we found that even if you increase the amount of people that are taxed, it's still not going to be a significant amount of small businesses and family farms.
And I think it's also important to note that given the 15-minute time limit, we couldn't go into huge detail into these policies, and that if these policies were to be implemented in the legislative process, we could nuance them and put these details in that would, for instance, exempt farms.
I want to ask a question about your proposal to incentivize preventative care. So I think if you could go back to that slide, the proposal was basically to pay people $100 to get their checkup, right? Is that am I characterizing that correctly? Where did you get your you had to make some assumptions about how that translates into an increase in the take-up of preventative care, and how that in turn translates into maybe a decrease in healthcare costs down the road, or improved productivity. Can you say a little bit more about where those estimates came from?
Yes, so looking at studies like the Lancet Journal of Public Health, we found that things like cancer, for example, when they're caught in their very first stages, are much more cost-effective to treat, and they're also much more successful in their treatment. So that helps save costs in things like cancer treatment, other diseases, other issues down the road, which will help people stay in the labor force longer, work more, but at the same time it is saving Medicare costs, things like that for the government.
And given that 25 to 40% of these healthcare costs are preventable, it will definitely help having the $100 incentive, because there are so many preventable problems that people can have with their health that will be saved, and this will increase productivity down the road.
I appreciated that you had a slide about uncertainty about the effectiveness of your policies, the ability to reduce deficits over time because of them. I think you said that you had sort of modeled those for individual policies. What was the policy that had the most uncertainty?
I think that our policy with the most uncertainty would have to be our zoning policy. While we feel through the Commerce Clause that Congress would be able to regulate that and would be able to greatly encourage that, and it would greatly help and pair with our immigration policies and help these zoning issues and housing issues we have right now. At the same time, there are concerns that cities or towns would push back on our policies, and I think specifically with that one, and that's kind of the one where it's a little bit, I think, the most tricky.
It depends on really how much pushback you face from like certain neighborhoods and certain demographics, and how successful they are in that pushback.
You said you would hope that Congress would look at your policies kind of as a package, but if they were, if you were to consider each of your policies individually, passed, and which one has the least chance?
I think that the policy with the greatest chance of being passed would definitely be our decrease in the payroll tax paired with the mortgage tax interest deduction, eliminating that. Again, because we mentioned that recently that was decreased from $1 million to $750,000, and there have been numerous studies done by various economists like at UPenn, Wharton, and additionally a lot of congressmen in both parties have been definitely considering eliminating that. It's been shown that it actually hurts the housing market in numerous ways.
Also, representatives always like to go back to their voters and say, hey, you have more disposable income because we decreased your income taxes.
Obviously, you guys have been taking a lot of interest and care to try to balance this out. So I'm curious with your Department of Defense proposal. Why did you focus on that policy as opposed to trying to find ways to cut hardware or something else, for example? I'm not saying it's wrong, just curious.
Yeah, so basically with our Department of Defense policy, we see that there are some threats to the U.S. We have Russia, we have China, we have North Korea. But we also know that the U.S. spends more on defense than the next 9 countries combined, and U.S. Department of Defense spending as a percentage of GDP has been decreasing since World War II, with some increases here and there. And the last increase was in 2001 with the War on Terror. And now that we're done with that, we believe that we can put it back on that path.
In addition, our proposal also is meant to increase the efficiency of the DoD because it addresses some of the issues brought up by the poor audit opinion of the DoD's financial records.
And recently, like last year, for example, regarding recruitment for soldiers, that was 25% lower than usual, and the Department of Defense had to drop their recruitment numbers. So our policies are focusing on helping those issues and mitigating those problems.
I have a process question. How did you go about choosing your theme and choosing the policies that you would pursue, and who did the research for the different ones? How did your group work together?
So I think with our big major issues like immigration, taxation, the environment, we went about looking for policies that would fit the green theme in terms of either the balance sheet or the environment, but also look for policies that have a tangible impact on the debt to GDP ratio and ones that balance out each other. So for like the environment, for example, we have the carbon tax and the hunting, and if we go back to that slide, you can see how that works. And then just one.
Yes, additionally, looking at how we delegated the work, we each worked on specific policies, but we also collaborated a lot in making sure our policies work together. For example, we talked about increasing immigration, but at the same time, we talked about building more houses. So, and like increasing occupational licensing across state lines. So we wanted to make sure that our policies kind of fit together. So even though we definitely each had our ones that we had our own expertise in, we worked a lot on doing those. And we did have an additional team member, wasn't able to make it here today due to an emergency medical issue, but between the 5 of us at the time, we were able to cover a lot of different policies.
Yes, we have about 3 minutes left.
Okay, so I want to ask a question about Social Security. So you're transitioning to this flat benefit, 150% of the poverty level, and what you're doing on the revenue side is you're actually reducing payroll taxes. I'm curious, because there are many proposals out there to raise payroll taxes to restore solvency to Social Security. Did you consider that, and why did you decide against that and actually in favor of cutting payroll taxes?
Yes, that's a great point. So if you notice with our payroll taxes, we paired the home interest mortgage deduction. And the reason for that was because we were aware that when we decreased payroll taxes, we would have issues with Social Security. And that's set up in such a way such that the revenue coming in from eliminating that mortgage deduction will actually balance out, I believe, by 2034 or 2035, all of those losses in Social Security. So that kind of helps pair the two.
You earmark that money for the trust fund because
Send it to Social Security.
because the payroll tax is dedicated for the trust fund.
Yes, so that's where the
You
money.
earmark it. Okay.
We'll be going to.
You have about a minute and a half left. Yeah, we have time for one final question.
So much here.
What do you see as, so going to this flat Social Security benefit, what do you see as the biggest objection to that?
The biggest objection is definitely those who are earning more than 150% of the poverty line. They will have a hit to the income that they expect in the later part of their life. However, given that though they're higher earners, they have a larger portion of their life and a larger source of income to save.
And that's why we also raised
1 minute
the
remaining.
IRA contribution limit from the existing level to $8,000, because that way we acknowledge the impact this policy has on high earners, and then we also kind of give them an alternative benefit.
Additionally, we don't believe these high earners are going to be very reliant on Social Security payouts given they can pay into their IRA.
All right. Thank you for your